All right. Jeremiah is an interesting book to study in the Old Testament because it is such an interesting blend of history and prophecy. It's most of the others, it's kind of pick one or the other. Isaiah, you remember we had those 3 chapters of history in the middle, but history flows through the entire book of Jeremiah. And he's one of the people, one of the prophets where we get to know the people who were significant in their life, other than just finding out he was the son of somebody. So as the opening of Jeremiah begins, we find that he is the son of Hilkiah, and there is more than one Hilkiah. So we don't know absolutely for sure if Jeremiah's Hilkiah is the same one, but there was a famous, he's part of a famous family, and that's the family of Abiathar, or Abiathar, or however you want to pronounce it. And this is a priest from back in the time of David. And it was Abiathar and I believe Nathan. Let me turn there. Nope, Zadok. In 2 Samuel chapter 15, David has conquered the city of Jerusalem. I don't know if you're aware of what's going on, but he wanted neutral territory, land that didn't belong to any of the 12 tribes, as his capital city. And so he and his men will go up through the water shaft, and any of you who have been to Jerusalem have seen that water shaft that connects into Hezekiah's tunnel, and invaded into the city of Jerusalem, which will later be called the city of David. And this is the lower portion of the city of Jerusalem. And he wanted to have the Ark of the Covenant there. Now, prior to his time as king, the Ark had been taken by the Philistines and then returned, and people died touching it, and David danced in front of it. But we find that in 2 Samuel chapter 15, Zadok the priest and Abiathar, a priest, carry the Ark of the Covenant into the city of Jerusalem. And so Abiathar is clearly one of the most important priests from the time of King David. At the death of David, we have a split between Zadok and Abiathar. And what happens is that David has more than one son who are going to claim the kingship. Now, it should be obvious that his firstborn son would get it. Well, when you have more than one wife, you have more than one firstborn. And the obvious choice would have been Absalom, but he wanted to be king before his dad was dead, which doesn't work real well. And Absalom is now dead. So other younger firstborn sons are putting in the claim. And technically, Solomon is not a firstborn. Bathsheba and David had a child that was conceived out of wedlock. She was married to Uriah at the time, and that child died shortly after birth. So Solomon is their first living son. And Adonijah is another son, the son of Haggith, and one of David's other wives. And so he gets together some of David's mighty men and some priests and prophets to back him for the kingship. And he conferred with Joab, which is one of the army men. He's the younger brother of Absalom, so it's possible he saw himself as his successor. But Zadok the priest and Benaiah the son of Jehoiada, which is one of the army men, and Nathan the prophet, and a bunch of other famous mighty men, they're going to back Solomon. And by the end of the chapter, you find that Solomon gets there first. And he is taken down to the river Gihon and is washed, anointed, crowned, and proclaimed king before Abiathar and Adonijah and the others in their group can act quickly. And the result is that Abiathar is captured by Solomon's men. And Abiathar, the priest, David's not comfortable killing a priest, although he will end up killing everybody who sustained the other claimant. It's just what you do, right? If you come to power, you kill everybody else. If you look back to Gideon, the judge in the book of Judges, he's one of 70 brothers. And he has 68 of his 69 brothers slaughtered when he takes power. It's just what you do. And we'll watch that in the life of Herod as he kills everybody around him, including wives and kids. So Solomon is not comfortable killing a high priest. So he tells Abiathar the priest, get thee home to Anathoth, and he thrust him out from being a priest before the Lord. Abiathar is apparently a descendant of Eli, who was the high priest at the time that Samuel was called by God. And the promise to Eli was not only that he would lose his position as priest and that his sons would die, but that his descendants would no longer be priests. And so it's at the time of Abiathar that his family gets kicked out of being able to serve at the temple, and they get sent home to Anathoth. Anathoth is a small town in the land that belongs to the tribe of Benjamin. That was the tribe of Saul, so it's one of the more powerful tribes. It descends from, obviously, Benjamin, who is the second son of Rachel. So it's clearly one of the preferred and powerful tribes. And it's 3 miles north of Jerusalem. So it's not very far out of town. But that is where Jeremiah is from, probably born in about 640. Now, the best way to understand Jeremiah and what's going on in his lifetime is to go to your Bible dictionary, if you have hard copy, and go to the section called chronological tables or chronology. Those have been taken out of the Bible dictionary and are simply separate parts of the study helps in your digital version on your phones, but they still have the chronology. I like using the chronology because one of the things that it does, in addition to listing the kings, and you have the kings of Israel and the kings of Judah. The kings of Judah, the southern kingdom, are in bold type. The kings of Israel are in all capital letters. Down the right-hand side, it talks about the history that's going on in the world around them. There are 2 suggested lists of possible dates. Okay. That's odd that it suddenly went berserk. If maybe you can turn that down, Randy. Which tells you don't be so stuck on a particular date because they didn't have ways to keep calendars that connect with ours very effectively. They usually will say in the 10th year of the reign of a particular judge or of a particular king, which is fine if you knew the year that they became king, but that's not always clear. So you'll notice there are different dates, often 50 years apart. But what I love is this column that says internal history. And I don't know if you can tell, but I have highlighted in yellow the names of the prophets. And that will tell you which prophet is living at the time of which king and what is going on at the time that they are speaking. It's not as hard to tell with Jeremiah because there's so much in his book about his interaction with the various kings, with the end of the supremacy of Assyria and the rise of Babylon to take its place, of Moab and Egypt confronting Babylon and wanting to be the successors to Assyria, and all of these wars going on during his lifetime. The man who is king when he's born is Josiah. Josiah is generally considered to be the last righteous king of Judah. And on the chart that we've made before of the timeline, we say there are 8 righteous kings. Josiah is the last of that line. When you're looking at the chronological tables, you can see that it's during the time of Hezekiah when Isaiah is prophesying that we come to the end of the northern kingdom when the Assyrians took them into captivity. Then you have only boldface type over here because only Judah is left. And you'll watch as we go through names that are all used in the book of Jeremiah, starting with Josiah in 640. Now, Jeremiah will actually begin to preach about 10 years later, in 628. And there's Jehoahaz, Jehoiakim, Jehoiachin, and Zedekiah. And we all know Zedekiah. Those are the kings that Jeremiah is prophesying in the presence of. But there are other prophets around during that same time, and how much interaction they had, we honestly can't tell. We know Lehi is alive at that time. Whether Jeremiah and Lehi knew each other personally, we don't know. But there's also Zephaniah and Obadiah. Daniel is carried off into captivity 10 years before Zedekiah dies. Did Jeremiah know Daniel or Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego? We don't know. It is possible. And then Ezekiel will prophesy after he's taken into captivity whether he knew Jeremiah before he's taken to Babylon. We don't know. But all of those are contemporaneous, along with Nahum, and a woman prophet. Her name is Huldah. Josiah wants to know how the Lord feels about how Jerusalem is doing, particularly because they just found the scroll that may be the book of Deuteronomy. It may be the whole redaction, a particular version of Torah. It's not always clear. Most people today think it's the book of Deuteronomy that they found during the time of King Josiah. And Josiah is really concerned because they're not keeping the law as it describes in the books. And we forget that the book of Leviticus has some instruction in it that is quoted by every one of these prophets, but we never read it in Come Follow Me in the book of Leviticus. And it is absolutely a critical text. It's chapter 26. And every one of these prophets is going to quote that verse. So that verse, I believe, comes to influence during the time of Josiah, along with the book of Deuteronomy.
What's the verse?
I'm sorry?
What's the verse?
The chapter is chapter 26, and it's the entire chapter. We'll get to it later today. Leviticus chapter 26. Now, I mention that because Jeremiah is a priest. The book of Leviticus is the book used by the priests on how to run the temple. But we'll never see Jeremiah acting as a priest in the temple because his family got kicked out. The town of Anathoth, where they are living, was actually mentioned all the way back in the book of Joshua, chapter 21. Joshua is assigning the cities of refuge. There are 6 cities that you can run to if you are accused of murder or manslaughter. So manslaughter, of course, is accidental death, maybe caused by there's an accident on your property and somebody falls and is killed, or is gored by your bull, or whatever. And the promise is that they can run to the temple, grab hold of the horns of the altar, which is what Solomon's enemies did in chapter 1 of Kings, and he sends men to kill him anyway, which is pretty gruesome to have people being murdered right as they're holding on to the altar of sacrifice inside the temple. Politics prevails. So you get these cities of refuge where if they're found not guilty, and thus it's not a capital crime, they're not going to be killed, the psychology is you still don't want to see this guy around that killed your kid, right? It would be like drunk drivers being exonerated and you have to see them. They live in your same little town. So anyone who is found not guilty still has to leave, and they go and live in a city of refuge. You'll also find Levitical cities that are assigned because the Levites and the priests have no land properties that they are going to inherit. Their land is the temple. Their income doesn't come from land, which is true for everybody else, essentially. It comes from scribing, meaning writing for people and reading for other people who are illiterate, and their service at the temple, and they're paid by being given part of the offerings at the temple. They get their portion. And so there are Levitical cities where the Levites will live, but there are also, and we don't really use this term, but priestly cities that are given just to the priests. And you'll notice in chapter 21, verse 13 of Joshua, they gave to the children of Aaron, the priest, Hebron and its suburbs. Now, when it says suburbs, it means the inhabited area, not the fertile fields lying around the outside of the city. Can you see how what Brigham Young thought of doing in Utah is actually Old Testament? The idea was that everybody would get a piece of land in the city of Salt Lake with enough for a kitchen garden behind it. But then their land on which they would raise animals and grow corn and wheat is outside of the city. And so you had 2 pieces of land, one that your house is on inside the city, and that's Hebron and its suburbs, but the land around it is the agricultural land. And so we find that over in, okay, I wrote it down. It's Joshua, let me find it here. Okay. Anathoth, Joshua 21:13, okay, it's 18, okay. It's covered by my bookmark. So Anathoth and her suburbs becomes a city given to the priestly families, not just Levites, but the priestly families. And you'll notice that Hebron, which is just southeast of Jerusalem, and Anathoth being just north of Jerusalem, the priests are living really close to Jerusalem where the temple is. So they're going to be traveling less than the Levites who are living all the way up in Dan and down in Beersheba and over on the east side of the Jordan River, the Transjordan, okay? In the land owned by Benjamin, the tribe of Benjamin. So Jeremiah, when he stands up to criticize the running of the temple and the king, he's an outsider. His family used to be in power, but no longer is. And the term a Jeremiad comes into the English language based on this criticism that Jeremiah does of people in power as someone who used to be in power but has been kicked out. And a Jeremiad is exactly what Jesus does when he goes into Jerusalem, picks up the whip, and cleanses the temple, criticizing the priests who are running the temple and the king and everybody who's in power. His family used to be in power, right? He's the descendant of the Davidic king, but got replaced because of politics. And it's probable that Mary was of the tribe of Levi because her cousin Elizabeth is, right? Giving Jesus not only authority through being the king, like David and Solomon, who act as the high priest at the temple, but also having Levitical priesthood. So total authority, but never acting as a priest inside the temple. That's also true for John the Baptist. He comes in that same kind of outsider status, even though his dad had been one of the high priests at the temple. John's out. For his own protection, probably. We also meet another interesting family. This is Shaphan and his descendants. And we'll find that Shaphan was important in the time of Isaiah, and now his sons and grandsons are going to side with Jeremiah. And so we actually meet other families besides the prophet who will have generational contact with those who are the prophets of God and which side they're on. So watch for Ahikam, which is the guy who takes Jeremiah out of captivity, out of prison, and that's the son of Shaphan, and then his grandson, Gedaliah, is given the responsibility to care for Jeremiah at the end of his life when the Babylonians are attacking. It's Gedaliah, the grandson, who takes care of him. So I think it's interesting that we get that. We also hear about his scribe, whose name is Baruch, and how a prophet would receive the word of the Lord and speak, and somebody else is writing it down, sometimes more than once. Because they'll take a scroll that's been written down to one of the kings, Jehoiakim. He hears the message and he hacks it into little pieces, kind of indicating he's not going to do what this prophet has said. He's going with a different prophet who has kinder words. And that even happened during the time of Josiah. It's interesting that when Josiah wants to know the word of the Lord concerning Judah, he invites Huldah, the prophetess, who lives just outside of Jerusalem. She's a mother and a wife, and he asks her to receive the word of the Lord. Now, she does, and she tells them that Judah will end up in captivity. There are rabbis who say that they asked a woman because they thought she'd give a kinder response, would be more merciful. Yeah, like Deborah, right? Merciful, right. There's another comment about Huldah that I thought was interesting. Why didn't they talk to Jeremiah? Because he was alive and prophesying during the time of Josiah. But the story that the rabbis give is, well, Jeremiah is up preaching among the 10 tribes. and wasn't in Jerusalem at the time that Josiah needed help. Now, I found that really fascinating because that would imply that after the tribes were taken into captivity, that there was still contact with them 100 years later down in Judah, that they're not as lost as we think they are. Now, why didn't somebody write down where they were at that point? That would have been helpful to us. But that's the idea, that Jeremiah actually was a prophet to all 12 of the tribes, even though he only is really speaking to 2 in his book. Okay, so politically, what's going on is the Assyrian Empire is losing its position. Egypt, Babylon, Medes, and Persia are all ready to step in and take over. As Assyria begins to crumble, it splits in 2, and the Egyptians decide that's a great time to attack. So they're going up through, if you think of the map, Egypt is southeast of what we call the Holy Land, and Assyria is, southwest, and Assyria is northeast. And the logical way to get there is from Egypt, cross the Sinai, and up through the coastal plain along the Mediterranean, and then east to Assyria, because to go through the western side, it's mountainous, there are robbers everywhere, that's crazy. That's where you find the story of the Good Samaritan, right? Because the guy doesn't want to walk through Samaria, so he's over on the other side in the hills, and that's just stupid. So the Egyptians come right up through Judah, and Josiah tries to stop them and is killed in the battle. Yes?
During that time that we were going through that area on our way south to Jordan and everything, we had we had 2 vehicles, one at the front of ours and one at the back of ours, protecting us. Because those mountains and cliffs are so treacherous. There are so many caves that you never know when someone, even now, could attack you.
Yeah, it's the hill country of Judea has never been a really safe place. And it's someplace that the Jews would go to hide from their captors. You'll read about the family of the Rechabites heading off in that direction. The problem is they went at the wrong time, and an army is coming, so they come back. The people at Qumran similarly are heading out into hill country where there are caves and places to hide, and that's where they will hide their records, which become the Dead Sea Scrolls. So after that terrible battle in which Josiah is killed, first I wanted to have one piece of 2 Kings that comes from the life of King Josiah, because it's important for us to see what kind of king he was and what he did to try and get the people back into God's good graces. So 2 Kings chapter 23, this is part of the Reformation under Josiah as he's trying to get the people to be righteous again, similar to Hezekiah, who the first thing he did when the Assyrians were threatening to attack was bring all the people to the temple and have them pay their tithes and offerings and put them under covenant again. So chapter 23, verse 3. Well, let's start at verse 2. The king went up to the house of the Lord, and all the men of the house of the Lord, all the men of Judah and the inhabitants of Jerusalem with him, the priests, the prophets, all the people, both small and great, and he read in their ears all the words of the book of the covenant, which was found in the house of the Lord, which may be the book of Deuteronomy. And the king stood by a pillar and made a covenant, or cut a covenant in Hebrew, before the Lord to to walk after the Lord, to keep his commandments and his testimonies and his statutes. The word statutes is sometimes translated as ordinances. So you know that's the same Hebrew word, chuk. All their statutes with all their heart and all their soul, to perform the words of this covenant that were written in the book. And all the people stood to the covenant, which means they agreed. They probably all lifted up their hand to the heavens. So putting them under covenant and cutting covenant is what Josiah does. And we will see that that's what King Zedekiah is going to try to do later in his ministry, and it's real important. Now, all of this stuff that we've talked about is easily available online. People have written all kinds of things about the life of Jeremiah and the history in the book of Jeremiah. Some of the things that I've printed out and downloaded and printed out include this timeline of the life of Jeremiah, this outline of the book of Jeremiah, which gives a paragraph for each book and tells you politically what's going on and what the important verses are in each chapter. That would be handy when you're reading. So that's one of the handouts I'll try to get to you. And then this is Jeremiah as the model for Jesus in the temple. Sound familiar? Well, in Matthew 16, as I said, Jesus standing up in the temple criticizing is called a Jeremiad. But in chapter 16 of Matthew, which is when they're up at Caesarea Philippi, and Jesus is there with the 12. Those of you who have been there to Banias, where the water flows out of the rocks at the base of Mount Hermon, that's Caesarea Philippi. Verse 13, when Jesus came to the coasts of Caesarea Philippi, and it's not coast, okay? It's not, I always thought Caesarea Philippi was Caesarea Maritima, which is over on the sea. Two different places. There's no coastline in Caesarea Philippi because it's at the base of a mountain. Coast means the regions around, not necessarily the edge of an ocean. Okay? And he said to his disciples, whom do men say that I, the Son of Man, am? And they said, some say you're John the Baptist. Now, you can understand that they might think that John has come back from the dead because by now John has been beheaded by Herod. But Jesus and John are cousins who were alive at the same time. How could he be John the Baptist, right? It just doesn't make a lot of sense. The others make a little more sense. Some think you were Elijah. That's Elias is Elijah. That's just the Greek form. And of course, Elijah was taken into heaven without tasting death, right, in the chariot. The same kind of idea is applied to Jeremiah by the rabbis. Some will say that neither Isaiah nor Jeremiah died. Now, there are certainly legends of their deaths, but the rabbis will say, no, they didn't die. They will come back and preach, and you'll see that in this verse. Others say you're Jeremiah. Okay? Don't be fooled by the S at the end. That's just the Greek form of the names. Elijah and Jeremiah is who they're talking about in verse 13. So some people actually think Jesus is Jeremiah back again. Why? Well, these are a sample of some of the tables and charts. Jeremiah as a type of Jesus. And it will list what happened to Jeremiah, what happened to Jesus, and these are the things they have in common. And it tells you what verses they're in. This is another paper from the site Hebrew for Christians, that's a great site if you haven't been there. Hebrew, 4, Christians.org. This one lists how the prophet Jeremiah foreshadowed the ministry of Jesus. Parallels between the trials, the literal legal trial between Jeremiah and Jesus. Now, anytime you're going to find a really deep study of the law in the Old Testament, you're going to find the name of Jack Welch at the bottom. This is from Farms, and this is another of the free things that you can get from BYU Studies. It was a book called Charting the New Testament, and you may want to be aware of this site for next year as you go through the New Testament, and this is how the trial of Jeremiah in chapter 26 is paralleled by the later trial of Jesus. Now, what that says to me is that Matthew and Mark and Luke were very aware of the language used in the book of Jeremiah, and that they purposely pointed out the parallels. Does that make sense? They wanted you to see how the experience of Jesus and Jeremiah is similar. Here's another interesting one. This is from Liberty University, a guy named Harold Wilmington. And he has an entire book that is contrasting Jeremiah and Christ, Elijah and Christ, Isaiah and Christ. Just each of them is a chart contrasting these types, the Old Testament types, in the lives of prophets. This one is from Summit Theological Seminary, written by Patty Bowling, and it's an account with all the verses included in it from Jeremiah and the New Testament paralleling each other. And I'll attach those because we don't have time to go through all of those. What I do want to do is look at a couple of things in particular. For example, Jesus is always using object lessons and parables, and that is true also of Jeremiah. He conducts what is called symbolic actions. He is told by God to do these things, and for example, take a loincloth, walk around Jerusalem wearing it, then go bury it, and in a couple of years, dig it up and see what happens to it. That's what's going to happen to Judah. Okay? Now, that also echoes back to Joseph's coat, which purportedly was buried and then dug up again. Is Joseph still alive? Is his coat still? Okay, so there's antecedents to some of these. He's told to go and watch a potter make a pot. Well, this is long after the metaphor of a clay pot being people. That's Genesis, right? Chapter 2. It's also the language that David uses in his Psalms. So the idea of people as a clay pot is not new to Jeremiah, but it's brought up again in Jeremiah as he watches the potter. And when the pot, I don't know if you've ever made a pot on a wheel, and he's watching him do it on a potter's wheel. Sometimes you're going along and the pot looks great, but apparently there's a weakness somewhere in the wall of it and it just collapses. And the potter just smushes it all back down, whams it a few times on the floor or on a tabletop, and starts over. Jeremiah is then told to buy one of those pots and take it into Jerusalem and smash it in pieces in front of the king and the priests. Now, when I was in Jerusalem, there's little pieces of clay pots on the ground everywhere. And I asked at one site if we could pick them up. And at some sites, they say absolutely not. And at others, they say, go ahead, they're infinite. You know, take all you want. They have, there are so many that it would be absurd to try and do carbon dating on every little piece of pottery. So I have a handful of pieces of broken pots from the Holy Land. The idea being people are going to be destroyed, right? But he talks about two different kinds of figs that grow on a fig tree. And Jesus, as he comes into Jerusalem at the end of, toward the Passion Week, of course, you find the fig tree that is all in bloom but has no figs on it. It's advertising, it's got all the leaves all over, but no figs on it. So that's one of the parallels. Another is that Jeremiah, well, he's to take good figs and bad figs, and that always makes me think of Indiana Jones. But this metaphoric language is really powerful throughout that area. It's just very common. Jeremiah is told to get a yoke and wear it. Walk around the city like he's a prisoner with a yoke over his shoulders. And it just annoys the king and the priests, and they will go and take the yoke off. It just bothers them so much. Often you will see the cross leaning on Jesus' shoulders like it's a yoke as he is carrying it through the streets of Jerusalem. But you will also hear Jesus say, and this is also in Matthew 16, "My yoke is easy and my burden is light." The yoke at the time of Jeremiah was hard. They were being sold to the Babylonians by God. They were going to become their servants, their slaves. And that's what Jeremiah is saying. You can't get out of this. God is on the side of the Babylonians. You are going into captivity. You are past the point of no return. He's not allowed to pray for them, which is difficult for a priest because that's kind of his job, right? Is to intercede and ask for forgiveness. And Jeremiah is told, you don't get to do that. Other things Jeremiah was not allowed to do. He was not allowed to get married. He was not allowed to have children, because both of those symbolize the positive aspects of the covenant, with Jesus as the bridegroom and Judah as the bride, right? Well, there is no relationship. I know you not, says Jehovah. I'm not going to be your husband at this point. Our covenant is invalid because you have walked away from me. You have left. You were unfaithful, following after other gods, and therefore, because of the actions of your ancestors and of you, you're going down. It's important to note that the book of Jeremiah is not chronological. It's kind of grouped by themes, so it leaps around in terms of the chronology. And the last thing I wanted to mention is that Jeremiah also wrote the book of Lamentations, which you ought to compare with Matthew chapter 23, which is woe unto you, scribes and Pharisees, you hypocrites. And it is very much Jesus lamenting. And then chapter 24 of Matthew, which is in our Pearl of Great Price as well, reordered, is very similar to the vision that Jeremiah has of the end of the city of Jerusalem. Because that's what 24 is the Roman attack and the end of the city of Jerusalem and what will happen to the people. And what's going to happen to the people is a destruction. Now, I want to look in depth at one chapter, which is chapter 31. This may be one of the most famous, most quoted chapters in Jeremiah. And we'll just look at about 10 verses in Jeremiah 31, starting at verse 1. At the same time, saith the Lord, will I be the God of all the families of Israel, and they shall be my people. This is repeating the covenant language from Mount Sinai and throughout all of the book of Leviticus, that I will be your God and you will be my people. Let me turn back to Ruth, because I love how the book of Ruth, if I can find it here, it's only 2 pages, 3 pages, so it's hard to find Ruth sometimes. And Ruth is an unusual character in that she is not an Israelite. She is a Moabite. And during the time of the book of the Judges, and the rule of the Judges, she is living in Moab when people leave Jerusalem and Judah and Israel because of famine and move to Moab for better living conditions. Now, if you've been to Jordan, that's where Moab was. Better agricultural conditions in Jordan? Then, okay, climate change has happened, folks. It used to be better over there. Around the Dead Sea, it didn't used to be quite so all bad. You know the story of Ruth, that conditions worsen in Moab, and both Naomi's husband and her two sons, the husbands of Ruth and Orpah, both all die. And so Naomi determines to go back to her homeland where there are laws for the care of widows. And there are three groups, and this is Leviticus again. There are three groups of people who have special protection under the law. It's widows or women who are single. Widow does not necessarily mean your husband's dead. It means you never got married, or you don't have a dad or a brother. It means you don't have a man legally responsible to take care of you. And in that situation, the priests are to step in and take that place. I've always loved that for years and years, it was the high priests who were given responsibility for the single women in the church, because that's so much this law of Moses idea. The widows, the orphans, and it's not children who have no parents, it's children who have no father. They very well might have mothers, but if they don't have a dad, what good is that going to do them? Because she can't own land. She doesn't have a herd of sheep or a flock of sheep or a herd of cattle. And so those children, and who is it that's told to go take those fatherless boys on the campout, right? And be their home teaching companions back when we used to do home teaching, now ministering. And the third group was strangers in the land. Now, in a way, Ruth is all of those. She is a widow. She's away from her family, because when you get married, you leave your family and move into the house of your husband. And your family no longer has any legal responsibility for you. If your husband dies, they'll take you back if they want to. And Orpah feels like her family will take her back. They don't have to. I mean, they got rid of you, they're done. And the whole idea behind a dowry, or the ketubah, the writing, which is like a prenuptial agreement of how much alimony the man will give you if he chooses to divorce you, because your family's not taking you back. And that money, that's what it's for. So the woman who has the 10 coins and loses one of them, she's just lost a tenth of her retirement income, of her financial security. So Ruth decides that she's going to go take care of Naomi, not let her go back alone. Now, we think of Naomi as really, really old. The fact that Ruth has no children at the time that she is widowed suggests that she's not a very old widow, especially since we'll find that she is able to have children. So she might be 15, 16, 17 years old. Ruth may be, or Naomi may be 35. We need to kind of rethink the ages of people in the Old Testament. 40 is old. Isn't that sad? Okay, so Ruth says, "Entreat me not to leave thee, or to return from following thee. For whither thou goest, I will go. Where thou lodgest, I will lodge. Thy people will be my people, and thy God, my God. Can you hear the words of conversion? She's going from worshiping the gods of the Moabites to worshiping the God of Judah. And we usually stop reading there, but it's important to continue. Where thou diest, I will die, and there will I be buried. The Lord do so to me, and more so, if aught but death part thee and me. She's making a covenant, using covenant language, that she will stay with Naomi for the rest of her life. And when she says, may God do to me and more so, it's probably accompanied by a gesture like the slitting of a throat. Okay? That's what God can do to me if I don't keep this promise to you. And so this language of I will be your God and you will be my people is commonly used from the time of Moses on down, and we should pay more attention to it. In verse 3 of chapter 31, the Lord appeared of old to me, saying, Yea, I have loved thee with an everlasting love. Therefore, with loving kindness have I drawn thee. This is using those phrases that we used, that we talked about last week, of rechem, which is mercy, and chesed, which is loving kindness. And it's the relationship between the bridegroom and his bride. We're going to see that not only in Isaiah, but in Jeremiah, and in the book of Ezekiel, and all the way through the New Testament. So watch for that kind of language. And you'll find that covenant is not so much legal obligations. In fact, the obligation you put yourself under in terms of a covenant is not legally enforceable. Because what you're promising to do is to comfort those that stand in need of comfort, and to mourn with those that mourn, and to show loving kindness and mercy. How can you legislate that? Right? That is a relationship concept. And you'll see that conflict come up in applying the law in the Book of Mormon, where you have judges who are responsible for civil law and the high priest who is responsible for covenant keeping. And there's a difference between the two. We'll often use the same language, but God doesn't. I mean, in Isaiah, he called heaven and earth as the witnesses in court, right? But how are you going to enforce that needing to show loving kindness? Can you legislate loving kindness? Okay. If we continue to 31 verses 6 and 7. There shall be a day that the watchman upon the mount of Ephraim shall cry, Arise ye, let us go up to Zion, unto the city of our God. Mount Ephraim is northwest of Jerusalem, and even though it's a hill, you come down from the hill and go up again to Jerusalem, which is Zion. For thus saith the Lord, Sing with gladness for Jacob, shout among the chiefs of the nations, publish ye, and say, O Lord, save thy people, the remnant of Israel. Do you see Palm Sunday? Hoshiana, save us now, is what the people are shouting. So here you have an image that will come up again on Palm Sunday. Verse 8, I will bring them from the north country and gather them from the coasts of the earth, and with them the blind and the lame, The woman with child and her that travaileth with child together, a great company shall come hither. They will come weeping with supplications. Who's going to come to Jesus to ask his help? It's going to be the blind and the lame who are carried by their four friends and let down through the roof of the ceiling, and women who are unable to have children, or women a woman whose child has died, the widow of Zarephath. The widow of Nain. Can you see the parallel there? How Elijah is like Jesus. That's why they said, is this Elijah come again, raising the sons of widows? Jeremiah 31:15. This one gets quoted in Matthew chapter 2 at the time that Herod is killing the baby boys down in Bethlehem, because Bethlehem is in the land given to the tribe of Benjamin. And Bethlehem is down near where Rachel died. Rachel is not buried in Hebron along with her husband Jacob and her sister Leah. You have Abraham and Sarah, you have Isaac and Rebekah, you have Jacob and Leah. Rachel is not there. She died somewhere else, and you get buried the day you die. That's because they're not doing embalming, thank you, like they did in Egypt. And so, verse 15, thus saith the Lord, a voice was heard in Ramah, lamentation and bitter weeping, Rachel weeping for her children and refusing to be comforted for her children because they were not. That verse, which is Jeremiah talking about what the conditions are going to be like around the city of Jerusalem when the Babylonians come in and kill everybody, and, well, not everybody, take a whole bunch captive, that Rachel will be bereft of her descendants and will be weeping for her children. That's the verse that is applied at the time that Herod kills all the boys under the age of 2 in the Bethlehem area. Rachel weeping for her children. That is actually a verse that has been used in the last 60 years to describe, applied to the Shoah or the Holocaust, of Rachel weeping for all the children that she lost in the Holocaust.
I heard that that's where, this also is where all of the captives that were taken, this is where they met.
It's possible. I don't know that we know that everybody was funneled through a concentration camp at Ramah. It could be. Okay.
No, I just mean in those days, back in when the 10 tribes were taken
Right. Verse 10. Skip that one. Hear the word of the Lord, ye nations. Declare it in the isles afar off, and say, he that scattered Israel will gather him, and keep him as a shepherd doth his flock. See the good shepherd? Jesus is the good shepherd. You can see where the language then of the New Testament comes from. John is continually quoting Jeremiah and other prophets and their descriptions of Jehovah as he talks about Jesus, the living water, right? You have hewn out cisterns that have no water. I'm the living water, is Jeremiah, and yet that's also what Jesus says in the book of John. 29 to 30, this is a really famous piece among Jews today, well, Jews since the time of the Christian church. In those days they shall say no more, the fathers have eaten sour grapes, the children's teeth are set on edge. That's where sour grapes. You also have Aesop, but this is one. But every man shall die for his own iniquity. Every man that eateth the sour grapes, his own teeth will be set on edge. So the concept is, yes, at the time of Jeremiah, Judah is going into captivity because of the actions of their forebearers. But in the future, you will only be punished for your own sins. And I have sat in classes where a teacher has said, and so you can see there is no idea of substitutionary atonement or one man dying for another's sins in Judaism. Well, maybe not after Jeremiah, but there certainly was before Jeremiah. That's the entire forgiveness of sins at the temple. When you take a lamb, you lay your hand on that lamb's head and it becomes you to make an atonement for you. So there is ambiguity in the Old Testament as the law changes from time to time, or as prophets apply it differently. Then you get to verse 31, which I'm sure you got in your gospel doctrine, or come follow me. Behold, the day will come, saith the Lord, that I will make a new covenant with the house of Israel and with the house of Judah, not according to the covenant that I made with their fathers in the day that I took them by the hand to bring them out of the land of Egypt. I hope you catch the ritual gesture there, which my covenant they broke, although I was an husband unto them, saith the Lord. Do you see how it's implying that the relationship between Jehovah and Israel coming out of Egypt was a marriage, and that the husband and wife took each other's hands and made a covenant together? And the Jews will use the whole Exodus time as the honeymoon. And then they cross the Jordan River into Judea, which is his home. That's the promised land. That's his house. It's the home of the bridegroom. And so that metaphor is going to follow all the way through. What we sometimes don't notice is that when this got translated into Latin, the Latin for New Covenant is Novum Testamentum, or New Testament. And that's where the names applied to the Old and New come from that we use all the time. It is from Jeremiah 31. When we talk about the Old Testament and the New Testament, we're not talking about an old bunch of witnesses and a new bunch, like bearing testimony, which is how I think most of us think of that. It's the Old Covenant and the New Covenant, and the irony is there isn't an old and a new, it's all one everlasting covenant. The question just is, how do you as an individual apply it? Is it just words that you write on the gates of your house, or are they written in your heart? It's the same words. It's the same laws. The question is, how is it being applied? That then brings us to 31, 35, and 36, which most people never read. I really love these. Thus saith the Lord, which giveth the sun for a light by day, and the ordinances of the moon and the stars for a light by night. Verse 36, if those ordinances depart from before me, saith the Lord, then the seed of Israel shall cease from being a nation before me forever. Now, I love this because of the language of ordinances of the sun and the moon and the stars, and I think of the Salt Lake Temple and the carvings on the outside and the Kirtland Temple and the symbolism of telestial, terrestrial, and celestial, and that if those ordinances cease, we no longer are sealing fathers and mothers to sons and daughters, and there is no seed, right? So it's literally, in a way, coming true. But what he's saying is, it is about as likely that I will fail to keep my covenant with Israel and Judah as it is that the sun won't rise tomorrow and that the moon won't go through its phases or the stars will cease to shine. That's how sure this covenant is. Randy and I have been talking about the song faith is knowing the sun will rise. And we go, faith is knowing. Do you see that there's a problem there? Faith is not knowing. When we teach our children that faith is knowing, we set them up for a fall. Because then when they have doubts, they think they have no testimony. Yet doubt is an essential part of faith, right? Do we know the sun will rise? Yeah, pretty much. As much as you know anything. We're not taking it really on faith that the sun will rise tomorrow. But that's how sure God's covenants are with us. So for us, it's faith. For him, it's knowledge. He knows what he's going to do. The question is more, what are we going to do? That then takes us down. That gets repeated again in chapter 33, by the way, verses 25 and 26, where it says, "Thus saith the Lord, if my covenant be not with day and night, if I have not appointed the ordinances of heaven and earth, then will I cast away the seed of Jacob and David my servant, so that I will not take any of his seed to be rulers." Do you see how it connects the ordinances of the sun and the moon and the stars with seed? I find that really fascinating. All right, Jeremiah 36, that chapter is all about how a prophet worked with a scribe and Baruch. And if that does not set up for you how Joseph Smith is going to work with Oliver Cowdery and Sidney Rigdon and Emma and the Whitmers and all of the various scribes, you can almost see Parley P. Pratt, who described watching Joseph sit at the table in the Revelation Room in Kirtland, in the Newell K. Whitney store, and write, and his scribe is writing down the Revelation, and Parley's watching it with his own eyes. That's Jeremiah 36. They're writing on different surfaces, but they're both using ink and they're both using scribes. I find it fascinating. Now what we're going to do is look at Jeremiah 34, which was not a part of the reading, and I find that tragic, because this to me is one of the most important chapters in all of Jeremiah. Jeremiah 34 is where Zedekiah tries to do what Josiah had done. He takes all the people to the temple to put them under covenant, to do a reformation and become righteous again, to live the law. That sounds really good, doesn't it? That worked for Josiah and his people. However, it doesn't quite work that way. Jeremiah is told, go talk to Zedekiah, that's verse 2, and tell him, thus saith the Lord, I'm going to give this city into the hand of the king of Babylon, and he will burn it with fire, and you're not going to escape. You will be taken, and your eyes will behold the eyes of the king of Babylon, and by the way, your eyes will behold the deaths of all your sons, except Mulek, we know, gets away. And then your eyes will be put out. Hear the word of the Lord. It's not going well for you, Zedekiah. So Zedekiah holds this covenant-making ceremony trying to change God's mind. Even though the prophet has told him there is no mercy this time. Zedekiah, you're an idiot. You have raised yourself up in rebellion against the king of Babylon who put you on the throne 10 years ago, and now here you are, and you're going down. So, Lachish has already been taken, verse 7. If you ever go to the British Museum, you can see the carvings on the walls of the city of Lachish being taken. It's very vivid. This is the word, verse 8, that came unto Jeremiah from the Lord, that King Zedekiah had made a covenant. This is actually cut a covenant that, we are going to use the board. The terminology, virtually every time it says made a covenant, is actually cut, and it's karat, K-R-T, karat, berit, B-R-Y-T, or T-H. Karat berit, this is covenant. This is to cut. And so that's the language, the idiom. You always cut covenants. Let's go back to Genesis 15 and see where this was very graphically depicted and what the promise is if you cut covenant with God. This is Abram. He has just returned from battle, setting Lot free. He set the prisoners free. He has paid his tithes to Melchizedek. He's refused payment from the people he rescued. And now he's home again in chapter 15. After all those things, the word of the Lord came to Abram in a vision. Now, I love to stop and say, what does that mean? Does that mean he's having some kind of odd dream in which he hears the word of the Lord? Or does the word, as in the beginning was the word, and the word was with God, and the word was God, the same was in the beginning, this is John, the word becomes a name for Jesus. Does he appear in a vision? Abram says, Lord God, what wilt thou give me, seeing I go childless? He said, okay, now we've got this covenant, and I'm keeping the covenant. I raised my hand to you, verse 19, blessed be Abram of the Most High, possessor of heaven and earth. Sorry, I meant to read 22. Abram said to the king of Sodom, I have lifted up my hand unto Jehovah, the Most High God, the possessor of heaven and earth. That's who I covenant with, is Jehovah, and I won't take any pay from you. So the promise is that he will have land and seed. So far, he has no land. He's camping on someone else's ground, and he has no seed. How's he going to get seed? Chapter 16, Sarah gives him Hagar, but that's not the answer. But he says, is my steward, Eleazar of Damascus, am I going to adopt him? Adoption becomes major language for entry into the covenant, particularly in the Christian church, as we talk about Jesus as our Father. Now, our Heavenly Father is literally our Father. Jesus is figuratively our Father. And so we are all adopted by him in the same way that Eleazar might be an adopted son. And Jehovah says to him, he will not be thine heir, in verse 4, but he that cometh forth from thine own bowels shall be thine heir. And he brought him forth abroad and said, now look toward heaven and count, it actually is count the stars, if thou shalt be able to number them. And he said, so shall thy seed be. And Abram believed in the Lord. This is the verse that gets quoted. I'm sorry, Genesis 15. We just read 5, and verse 6 is the one that is quoted by Paul in Hebrews, or the author of Hebrews if it isn't Paul, speaking of Abram as the father of the faithful, having this kind of faith. He counted it unto him for righteousness. And then Jehovah says, I am the Lord, I am Jehovah that brought thee out of Ur of Chaldees to give thee this land to inherit it. And Abram responds, okay, Lord God. And it's, notice that twice he's used the term Lord, Adonai, not Jehovah, because it's not all 4 capital letters. Watch that change. Whereby shall I know that I will inherit it? give me some surety, give me some kind of guarantee. And this is the guarantee that Jehovah offers him. Take a heifer 3 years old, and a she-goat 3 years old, and a ram 3 years old, and a turtle dove, and a young pigeon. All of those, by the way, are used at some point at the temple for offerings. We forget that female animals, a heifer and a she-goat, would be offered at the temple, not for sin, but certainly for other offerings, as were the turtle dove, pigeon, and ram. And Abram knew exactly what to do with these. God doesn't have to tell him, because this is how everybody in the ancient world was making contracts, leagues, treaties, covenants with each other. He took unto him all of these and divided them in the midst, and laid each piece one against the other, but the birds he divided not. What's happening is that Abram is cutting the large land animals in half, dividing between joint and marrow, and laying their carcasses on the ground. And I use the word carcass because that's the one in Leviticus. And then you have two birds, one's laying here, one's laying down here. They have not been cut, their necks have been wrung, they're just dead laying on the ground. And the birds he divided not. When the fowls came down upon the carcasses, this would be raptors, birds of prey, Abram drove them away. When the sun was going down, a deep sleep fell upon Abram. A horror of great darkness fell upon him. That phrase, I think they really captured well in the new version of the first vision up at the Church History and Art Museum, where you're sitting there in the grove, and it's a 270-degree theater, and everything goes gray and black, and there's a horror of darkness as Satan takes power over Joseph at that moment. Satan is not happy when we enter covenants or when we listen to the Lord. And then God, Jehovah, says to Abram, "Know of a surety that thy seed shall be a stranger in a land that is not theirs, and shall serve them, and they shall afflict them for 400 years. Then I will judge that nation, and they will come out with great substance. You, meanwhile, will go to your fathers in peace and be buried at a good old age," which he is, "but in the 4th generation, they, your descendants, will come hither again, and I will give them this land." That's the promise of land to his seed, is that in 400 years, they'll get it. So when individuals wonder why their son died before his patriarchal blessing has been fulfilled, well, for Abram, it took 400 years. Probably your patriarchal blessings will be fulfilled within 400 years. And it came to pass, when the sun went down and it was dark, a smoking furnace and a burning lamp passed between the pieces. Now, the normal thing to do if you were cutting a covenant with an individual was that each of you would walk between the pieces. And as the blood, and can you imagine, you've got a heifer, a she-goat, and a ram that you've just slaughtered. How much blood is there laying around? Like gallons, right? And when you get that blood on you, the curse connected with the covenant is sure. And blood always means death, right? Well, not always. And what happens here is that Abram never walks. Instead, two objects, which will continue to be the symbols, two of the symbols for Jehovah, a pillar of fire by night and a pillar of smoke or cloud by day. That's what's over the tabernacle all the 40 years. And you can see where it comes from. The fire that is burning perpetually on the altar becomes the fire by night that you see at nighttime in the dark. There's no external lighting, remember, in the ancient world. And during the day, as you're offering offerings, both on the altar of sacrifice and inside on the altar of prayer, the incense and the smoke rises and creates a cloud that goes up. And that then represents Jehovah walking not once, but twice, which means Jehovah is walking in Abraham's place. The words that were used, and I'll have a handout for each of you that you can download, are very much the words that Ruth used. May the Lord do this to me and more so if I don't keep this covenant. May the Lord cut me off. May my carcass lay on the ground like these animals if I don't keep my covenant with God. But it's not Abram who walks. So the first time that Jehovah passes through, perhaps as the cloud, it's as if he's saying, if I don't keep my covenant with you, you can cut me off. I will no longer be your God. Now, how likely is it he's not going to keep his covenant? We've already talked about that, right? Is the sun going to rise? And then if you, Abraham, or Abram in this case, don't keep your covenant, you can cut me off. My carcass will lie on the ground. I will die in your place. That is the gospel of Jesus Christ in the life of Abraham. That's the covenant that he offers. That is the new and everlasting covenant, that when we sin, he dies in our place. That's the entire metaphor going on at the Old Testament temple, that the firstborn, perfect Lamb of God dies in our place. So that's the covenant that Zedekiah, that's the ritual that they are doing in Jeremiah 34, is cutting up animals at the temple. Now go back to 34 and read with me. This is the word that came to Jeremiah from the Lord. After King Zedekiah cut covenant with all the people which were in Jerusalem to proclaim liberty unto them. Now, proclaiming liberty to the captives, which means people that you've held in financial slavery, bondmen because they owed you a debt. This is Israelites, or foreigners that you're holding in slavery because you conquered them in war. You are to set the prisoners free. That's part of Leviticus 26, setting the prisoners free. And Leviticus 23, that's the Jubilee year and the sabbatical year. In the 7th year, you set all the Israelites free. In the 50th year, you set all people free. That's why at Juneteenth, it's a Jubilee, right, as the slaves are set free. That every man should let his manservant and every man his maidservant, being an Hebrew or a Hebrewess, go free. That none should serve himself of them, to wit, of a Jew, his brother. We're going to set all the Jews free. Everybody who owes us money, we're forgiving all the debts. Now when all the princes and the people which had entered into the covenant heard that they should let their servants go free, they obeyed and let them go. But afterwards, they turned. Now you have to think about turned. They had already turned in repentance toward God. So if they're turning again, what direction are they now going? East. Not a good idea. They caused the servants and handmaids whom they had let go free to return and brought them back into subjection. They let them go free for what? A day? Maybe? Therefore, the word of the Lord came to Jeremiah. Thus saith the Lord God, I cut covenant with your fathers in the day I brought them forth from the land of Egypt, out of the house of bondsmen. You were once slaves yourselves. At the end of 7 years you should let every man his brother in Hebrew, which has been sold unto you, when he has served you for 6 years, he shall go free in the 7th year. But your fathers hearken not. Nobody's ever lived that law. And now you were turned and had done right in my sight, proclaiming liberty every man to his neighbor. You had cut a covenant before me in the house which is called by my name, but then you turned again and polluted my name. What's his name, do you remember? Merciful, gracious, long-suffering. You doing that? And caused every man his servant, every man his house handmaid, that he had set at liberty at their pleasure to return, and brought them back into subjection, to be your servants. Now, servant and slave are the same word in Hebrew. To be your slaves again. Therefore, thus saith the Lord, because you have not hearkened unto me in proclaiming liberty, every one to his neighbor, every man to his brother, every man to his neighbor, behold, I'm going to proclaim a liberty for you. You are free to die by the sword and by pestilence and by famine. And I will make you to be removed from all the kingdoms of the earth. You are now free from the land. You are free from any obligation you had with me. You are free to die. Your carcasses will lay on the ground. And the men, I will give the men that have transgressed my covenant, which have not performed the words of the covenant which they had made before me, which they had cut before me, when they cut the calf in two and passed between the parts thereof. You see, they're doing the exact same ceremony, and they're doing it with hypocrisy. They have no intent to keep this covenant. They take their servants right back into captivity. And so it's not for the sins of their fathers, it's for their own hypocrisy, their own failure to show mercy, their own inability to recognize their own iniquities and sins, that the people were judged. And so they go into captivity. And Jeremiah expects to go with them. Unfortunately for Jeremiah, his friends don't want that to happen. And so although he is in the prison of Zedekiah's court when the Babylonians attack, he was not taken by the Babylonians. And instead, it's Shaphan's grandson, Gedaliah, who takes him back to Anathoth. And he is there until a group of people from Judah who have not been taken by the Babylonians decide, we know what we'll do. We'll be free from this Babylonian captivity. We will go back to Egypt. There's food down in Egypt. How do you think God feels about you returning to Egypt? What's the covenant? I will bring them out of Egypt. Yeah. So they get down to Egypt, and God speaks to them through Jeremiah. Fine. You'll die of famine, pestilence, and the sword in Egypt. You're not getting out of it. And Jeremiah then writes his lamentations in Egypt as he watches everyone being destroyed. As you read those Lamentations, the book of Lamentations by Jeremiah, You want to think of Jesus and the 12 sitting on the Mount of Olives, looking at the temple which the Babylonians destroyed. And all those people who would be taken into captivity. The message of Jeremiah, the weeping prophet, is very much a part of the New Testament. And as we understand and read that book, we will come to recognize next year, when we read the Gospels, how vividly Jesus fulfilled all of the prophecies of Isaiah, which tells us that his final prophecies about the world being destroyed, not just Jerusalem at the time of the Romans, but all the wicked eventually being destroyed, are true, and encourage us to keep our covenant, which we have made, that we would mourn with those that mourn, set prisoners free, help the widows, the orphans, and the strangers in the land. That we might do that and keep our covenant, that we might have his protective care, is the message of Jeremiah. I leave it with you today in the name of Jesus Christ. Amen.
Amen.